Hello, everyone. The following testimony is from Clara, who never imagined that morning would be her last. In one instant, she was reaching out to grab a glass of water. In the next, everything dissolved into absolute darkness. But death was not the end. It was only the beginning. She saw her own lifeless body on the ground, observing from above, as if her soul had been ripped from her physical form. Before she could comprehend what was happening, an irresistible force pulled her into a deep void, where anguished whispers echoed around her. Fear engulfed her, consuming her completely. And then, a radiant light tore through the darkness. Before her stood an imposing figure, serene but filled with an indescribable authority. His gaze pierced her soul, and in his expression was both love and urgency. It was Jesus. What he revealed next about the future, and a sign that would mark humanity, would change everything. For all my life, I never imagined I would one day write these words. My name is Clara, and my existence has always been marked by silent devotion, removed from the chaos of the world. Since I was young, I gave my life to God, taking my vows in a convent and dedicating each day to prayer, service, and seeking a deeper connection with Christ. While the world outside spun at a frantic pace, I found peace in simplicity. My mission was clear: to help the needy, care for the sick, and intercede for the lost. I never questioned my purpose, as I trusted fully that God guided my steps and had placed me exactly where I was meant to be. I did not long for recognition or wealth. Earthly concerns, money, power, ambition, meant nothing to me. My only concern was faith. But what happened that morning changed everything. If anyone had told me I would die one day and return with a message of urgent importance, I would have rejected the idea without hesitation. I had heard of near-death experiences, but they always seemed like distant, unreal stories, things that happened to others, never to me. And yet that cold morning, I found myself faced with the unthinkable. It all began with an inexplicable fatigue. In the days prior, I had felt exhausted, with heavy muscles and shortness of breath, but as always, I ignored these signs, thinking they were simply the result of fasting and long hours of prayer. I lived a disciplined life, always demanding more from myself in the name of my devotion. I believed God would sustain me, as he always had. That morning, I woke up before dawn, as usual. The rain softly drummed against my window, and the air was damp and cold. I reached for my Bible, but my fingers were trembling, an odd sensation of numbness spreading through my hands. I shook off the feeling and stood up, but something was wrong. My legs wobbled, and the instability made me stop. I stood there, telling myself I just needed a little water, a moment to regain my strength. However, when I reached for the glass on the bedside table, my vision began to blur. The room around me seemed to tilt. The weight on my chest grew unbearably, and my breathing became shallow, as though something was pressing against me. When the glass slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor, I felt my vision completely darken. I tried to lean on the table, but my legs didn't respond. The last moment of clarity I had was the distant sound of hurried footsteps approaching the door, and a voice, desperate, calling my name. And then, everything disappeared. When the darkness enveloped me, it was different from any sensation I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of light, but a total absence of everything. No sound, no touch, no sensation. It was a profound and incomprehensible stillness, a lack of weight, of presence, that left no room for any emotion or thought. For a moment, I thought I was trapped in a deep dream, in those confused spaces between sleep and wakefulness, but as moments passed, I realized the truth. I was no longer in my body. I could see my body sprawled on the stone floor, my clothes scattered around, my face serene but lifeless. My lips were slightly parted, as if I had tried to speak before falling. There was no movement. My chest did not rise and fall. I was completely still, completely absent, and yet I was there, aware of everything around me. Then my neighbor Helena's crying reached my ears. Her voice, desperate and muffled, resonated in the empty space. My God, please someone help me. She was at the door, her face pale and trembling, trying in vain to call someone. Her anguish was palpable, but surprisingly, I did not feel the same anguish, the same panic that I should feel at my own death. Instead, a strange sense of detachment overtook me. It was as if I was watching everything from the outside, like a spectator in a movie. I wanted to scream. I wanted her to know I was still there, but I couldn't. I had no body, no mouth, but there was something else. Something invisible was pulling me, an irresistible force I couldn't understand, but one that was pulling me with such intensity it made me feel light as a feather. I rose effortlessly, the weight of gravity no longer affecting me. The room, the broken glass on the floor, Helena's face, everything was distancing from me as I ascended, passing through the ceiling as if it didn't exist. With each passing second, I drifted further and further from what I knew. Soon, everything I knew vanished. The room, the city, the world, everything dissolved behind me. I found myself enveloped in an absolute void. It was not a normal darkness, but an oppressive, deep darkness, as though it had a life of its own. It was a space without boundaries, an expanse that stretched beyond what my mind could comprehend. At first, there was silence, but then whispers began to emerge. These whispers were low, almost imperceptible, but soon they grew louder, overlapping one another. The voices, filled with lament, regret, and something even deeper, despair, took form around me. Some people cried, others screamed, and some seemed to challenge the void with words of anger. I tried to identify where these sounds were coming from, but I was suspended in the void, with no direction, no body, no form. The voices continued, and a sense of terror took over me. Is this hell? I wondered. Was I being judged for my life, for my doubts, for my failures? Throughout my journey, I always sought to serve God. But, like everyone, I had my weaknesses. Perhaps this was the reason I was here. Perhaps my lack of perfection was my condemnation. The thought paralyzed me for a moment, and fear overwhelmed me, amplifying the voices around me. Suddenly, something moved in the darkness. It was not a shape, not a being. It was an immense presence, something so grand and suffocating that I could feel its intensity without being able to see it. A presence that seemed to observe me, as if it were aware of my existence, though I could see nothing. Terrified, I tried to react, to scream, but I had no mouth. Then the whispers turned into screams of agony. Panic began to consume me, and I, unable to move or do anything, could only feel the void around me deepening. Then, something illuminated in the distance. The light was not strong, but it had an immense presence, as if it were the last hope in a vast abyss. At first, it appeared like a distant star, almost imperceptible, but soon its intensity increased, tearing through the darkness and making the shadows retreat. The moment I saw it, the voices surrounding me began to quiet. The air around me became lighter, and a sense of relief started to replace the fear. The light grew, and with it, a warm, comforting energy spread over me like a wave of golden fire. The void, the pain, the fear, everything dissipated as the light drew near. Something inside me knew I was being rescued. I was no longer alone. I was no longer lost. The presence approaching was divine. As the light grew, it revealed the form of a being that emanated serene authority, yet full of compassion. He was before me now, and it was not just his presence that touched me deeply, but the love overflowing from his eyes. It was Jesus. The moment I saw him, something inside me recognized his divinity. Not just a man, not just a master, but the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. His penetrating gaze carried the full weight of eternity, but at the same time, he looked at me with a kindness I couldn't describe. I involuntarily fell to my knees before him, not by choice, but because my soul could do nothing but surrender to the vastness of his glory. Everything I had ever known, my life, my prayers, my struggles, became irrelevant in his presence. It was as though everything I had done until that moment was merely a whisper in the vastness of the universe. I knew I didn't need to say anything. He already knew everything. For a long time I stayed there, unable to speak, but he, in his infinite patience, extended his hand. His voice was soft but unbreakable, and his words echoed within me. "You need to see." Suddenly, the light around us changed. It softened, as if something were about to happen. The warmth decreased, but in a comforting way, and in the next moment I was no longer before him. I was in another place. Now, an enormous city stretched before me with tall buildings, shining lights, and people moving along wide streets in an impressive order. The city seemed peaceful, but soon I noticed the details that made it oppressive. The people walked without expression, as if in a trance. Their faces were empty of any feeling, and their bodies moved mechanically. There was no joy, no life, only perfect functioning, like a machine. That was when I saw it. A symbol, a small sign, almost imperceptible, on the right hand or forehead of everyone. It was everywhere, on billboards, on digital screens, on kiosks, where people passed their hands to enter buildings, buy food, or access transportation. No one questioned it, no one resisted. Everyone accepted it, without a fight. The shock was immediate. I realized that this was not just a political or economic imposition. The symbol was not just a social control. It was something much deeper, more spiritual. The sign was not forced. People accepted it willingly, but in doing so they gave up something immeasurable, something eternal. The voice of Jesus echoed in my mind, sad but firm. They will be taught to believe that they have no choice, but I will provide. His words penetrated my being, and as they settled in my heart, I understood the cruel truth. People accepted the sign not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of hunger, exclusion, abandonment. The scene changed. Now I saw those who refused to take the sign. They were not part of the shining cities. They were the exiles, the rejected. I saw a mother in a market, trying to buy bread with a few coins, but the seller refused. She didn't have the sign. Therefore, she had no right to buy. I saw a man kneeling, begging for medicine for his sick wife, but the doctor refused to treat her. What was left for those who resisted? They were pushed to the margins of society, ignored, marginalized. The vision before me changed once again. Now, I saw a distorted version of a world where everyone who had taken the sign appeared unchanged at first glance. However, upon looking more deeply, I could perceive something horrifying. There was something empty in the eyes of the people. At first it was subtle, a slight apathy, but over time it became more evident. Their emotions disappeared, their connection to their families, to their friends, to their humanity faded away. I saw a woman who no longer seemed to recognize her own son. She looked at him with indifference as he, with his dirty face and pleading eyes, called for her. But she didn't stop. She didn't see him. She no longer loved him. The sign had taken everything from her, even her ability to feel love. I saw a husband whose wife had refused to take the sign. He looked at her, but in his eyes there was coldness, a distance. They no longer saw each other, as if the bond that once united them had been broken forever. What the sign had done to these individuals was more than a physical mark. It had erased the most precious thing in their essence, their humanity. They were alive, yes, but they were shadows of who they had been before, empty, devoid of everything that made them human. The scene began to dissolve, and once again I found myself before Jesus. Now he looked at me with an expression of sadness, but also of hope. His presence radiated a deep peace, as if he knew that despite everything that was to come, there was still time. I wanted to speak, I wanted to question him, but he simply looked at me with immense seriousness. I knew he wanted me to see what was happening, but I also knew he was giving me something more, the chance to choose. He spoke again, his voice soft but full of authority. "You must tell them." With a serene gesture, He indicated for me to look ahead once more. When the vision before me faded, a new scene appeared before me. Now, I was in a place far from the shining cities, where those who had refused the sign gathered. It was a barren and cold land, with deserted streets and desolate landscapes. Those who had resisted were scattered, some walking, others gathering in small circles. They were all searching for something: safety, food, a refuge. I saw a woman with her children walking through dark streets, their clothes torn, their faces marked by fatigue and hunger. They had nothing more to eat, but the woman's gaze was determined. She held her children's hands tightly, and her eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if she were looking for a place where she could still fight for a dignified life. She didn't have the sign, and with that, the resources society once provided were now out of reach. But she didn't give up. Her faith was alive, and it kept her standing despite everything. As they walked, I saw a man kneeling in barren land, digging the earth in search of something, anything, to feed his family. His hands were covered in earth, his fingers bleeding, but he didn't give up. He looked up at the sky and prayed fervently, asking God to provide. And then, something miraculous happened. The earth began to open, and plants sprouted where there had been nothing before. Fruits hung from trees, firm roots stretched out, offering what they so desperately needed. The man stood up, amazed. He knew he was not alone, that his faith had been answered. Elsewhere I saw a small group in a cave. The fire was dying slowly, and a child had a high fever. A woman approached, placing her hands on the child's forehead and praying. She knew that without access to medicine, they could only trust in divine power. And in the next instant, the child's fever disappeared. She smiled, looking at everyone around her, and an inexplicable peace spread among them. God had proved once again that he was with those who maintained their faith. However, not everyone resisted. Some were on the brink of surrender. I saw a man who had once been firm in his faith, now crying while holding his hungry daughter. He looked at her, and with tears in his eyes, he began to question his decision. If I take the sign, she will survive. Would God forgive me? Would he understand? He murmured, his voice broken by pain. His wife, standing beside him, looked at him firmly and said, "If we lose everything but still have our soul, we have lost nothing. If we gain the world but lose our souls, we have lost everything." He turned away, conflicted with his own feelings. Some succumbed, while others stood firm. But what they all shared was an inner struggle, a battle between fear and faith. Jesus, with a gentle gesture, led me to one more vision. Now, I was before a woman who, in the past, had been rich and powerful. She was a leader among her people, respected and admired. But now, everything she had was gone. She was alone with nothing before a government official who offered her a choice: accept the sign, and she would have back everything she had lost: food, shelter, a guaranteed future. The official spoke with an almost seductive calm, trying to convince her, "You no longer have to suffer. Take the sign, and you'll get your life back. You don't have to live in the shadows anymore, without resources, without security. The world has already moved on. Take the step and join us." The woman was silent for a moment, looking at him. Her eyes were teary, but there was strength there, a determination that could not be ignored. She looked at the man before her and with a firm voice replied, "My life no longer belongs to me. It belongs to God." The moment she spoke those words, something happened. She knew she was making an irrevocable decision. Her choice was made with courage, without hesitation, even though the price was high. She was taken without words, without promises of salvation. But her face shone, serene, because she knew that even in adversity, God had chosen her. As the vision faded, I found myself once again before Jesus. His eyes were filled with compassion, but also with deep sadness. He knew the time was running out. The battle between good and evil, between light and darkness, was about to intensify in an irreversible way. "This is the moment," he said, his voice resonating deep within my being. "Now, more than ever, The choice is clear. They need to know. The time is near. I looked at him, feeling the weight of responsibility. But how? How will they survive without the sign? I asked, doubt rising in my mind. He answered with a serenity that seemed to transcend time. The world will say there is no choice, that the sign is the only way. But I will provide. The faith of those who remain steadfast will be the key. The vision began to dissolve, and the world I knew seemed to slowly fade away. I felt my body being pulled back, as if being dragged back into reality, where everything would begin again. The light around me began to shine with a blinding intensity, and then everything turned white. The vision vanished, and I found myself again before Jesus. He looked at me with an expression that conveyed both sadness and hope. "Time is short," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "The choice will be made soon, and many are already being deceived." I wanted to ask more, but the words wouldn't come out. He knew my mind was filled with doubts. "Tell them what you saw. The world will tell them there is no other option, that accepting the sign is the only way to survive. But this is a lie," he continued. "I will provide," he affirmed, with the same tranquility as before. But now there was an unshakable certainty in his words. The faith of those who resist will be the key to salvation. I felt a growing weight on my chest. It was hard to imagine how people would face the approaching future, but the vision of Christ, with his light and strength, gave me a spark of hope. He was with us, and that was all I needed to know. "There is no middle ground," Jesus concluded, his presence radiating an indescribable peace, even amid the chaos that was drawing near. "The time of choice is coming." With these words, the vision dissolved once again, and I found myself back in my body. The pain of returning was intense, as if my soul had been yanked suddenly from a safe and familiar place. I opened my eyes, still dazed, and saw Helena by my side, desperate. Her hands gripped mine tightly, and her voice trembled with panic. "Clara, please stay with me. You're coming back to us. Please don't leave me." The world seemed to spin around me, and the feeling of weakness was overwhelming. But looking at her, something inside me told me that I had a mission, something far greater than what I had known. I had been brought back for a reason. My words came out with difficulty, but the urgency was clear. "The time is coming. The choice will be made, Helena. There will be no more escape. The sign. They will say there is no other option, but God. He will provide for us. Faith will be our salvation." She looked at me with eyes full of fear and hope. "But how will we survive, Clara? How will we face this?" I looked at her with all my conviction. "With faith, Helena, with faith." And with that, the vision dissolved once more, and I knew the journey was just beginning. The future was ahead of us, and the choice would be ours, to accept or resist, and God would guide us until the end. The world was changing, and the choices that would be made soon would define the fate of many. There was no more time to waste. I knew what I had seen and what I needed to share. The battle to come would not just be a fight for survival, but for the soul of each individual. The words of Jesus echoed in my mind. "They will say there is no choice, but I will provide." In my journey, I had seen the truth. It would not be the sign that guaranteed our lives, but our faith, our resistance to the fear and control being imposed. Now, more than ever, it was the moment to be prepared, to be firm in our convictions, and to know that even in the darkness, the light of God would always guide us. The future was before us, and the decision was clear: resist or submit. The choice would be made, and when the moment came, there would be no middle ground, only faith or surrender. The time to choose was now.